All right. Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian City the Immaculata with you guys this morning. Maranatha, we're in a new season here. I guess it would be appropriate we begin just with short prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O come, Emmanuel, ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, till the Son of God appear. Maranatha. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Hello, everyone. Let's see, I've already got some questions and stuff lined up. I'll come back to these because I probably get to them here in my notes. I have just a little bit of housekeeping quickly. I have a list of titles that I am working on for you guys. I always have to make this project a kind of a balance between what I'm interested in versus what you guys will watch. Personally, I don't really care so much about the reach of this channel. I would like to see, quality viewership over quantity, if such a thing exists. And really, with few exceptions, I mean this sincerely, you guys have been great. I really value the feedback that you all give. I like seeing the requests in the comments, and I will always try to do what I can to accommodate within reason the subjects you guys like. Problem is I tend to suffer from, I don't even know what to call it. Like it's been a thing for me just since I'm like a little boy. I was in school, I was an A&F student, to put it bluntly, and it drove my poor mother crazy. But if it was a subject that I took interest in, you couldn't pry me from it. I would turn that subject upside down, inside out, four-dimensionally, several times over. If it was something that I wasn't interested in, you could absolutely just forget it. I was not going to spend any time with it. Nothing in the world could get me to either. And I really, as you kind of grow up, I grew out of that tendency. For one thing, money's a major motivating factor for the things that we will dedicate our times to. But and of course there's no paycheck for doing this. I do this out of love for the faith. So because of that, you all will know that for the most part that the subjects that I'm engaging in here are ones that I'm passionate about. And that's really not a bad thing. I've seen channels on YouTube, and God bless them for their needs or the necessities, but that really have suffered when they come to rely on a cash flow. I've seen content suffer from otherwise what was good channels. And that's not something I want to see my channel ever undergo. So because if it's on here, oh dear viewers out there, you can rest assured that it's because it's something that I love, which tends to reflect back on the subject matter at hand. Enthusiasm is a contagious thing. So onward, Christian soldiers. And I really actually have my job cut out for me today, because while I am passionate about our scholastic tradition, the defense of it can be an uphill thing, especially from the small voices of us out there, right? We feel like I can sympathize with St. John the Baptist, crying in the wilderness. But I know you, oh ye loyal listeners, will for the most part, I think, enjoy this today. And as always for me, the question begins, with where do we start. And I chose today to begin with a little man, and I say that derogatively, or as a derogatory comment, I admit, but I chose one little man whose ideas were not little. He almost brought about the death of Catholicism in Europe. And no, I don't mean Luther, I don't mean Calvin or any of those. I'm speaking about none other than the prolific little Frenchman named Voltaire. Voltaire. The reason I go with Voltaire and not some other intellectual is because I really think that his ideas and his rhetoric, no matter how juvenile and ridiculous it was not pedantic, and it struck a nerve among the thinkers, intellectuals, and normies alike in French society at the time, 18th century French society. He attacked with a visceral, acidic pen all of the institutions that France, upon which France had stood for centuries, in a way that had an air of, refined elegance to it, combined with a dry wit and cynicism of like the everyman's language. So Voltaire, who dies in 1778, right as the American War for Independence was getting really underway, right before the French monarchy would go into very serious debt financing said war. One of Voltaire's most serious, most consistent, and backed by popular support attacks was against what the New Age religionists today would refer to as organized religion. He expounded in lengthy tracts about the glory of a very distant deist God over and against sort of a silly superstitious thing like the Catholic Church, a church which he believed should be crushed by any means necessary in order for civilization to advance, to evolve, or to be saved for that matter. And the Jacobin revolutionaries who took control in the wake of the overthrow of the monarch took Voltaire very seriously. And so upon them coming to power, they went about systematically dismantling, discrediting, deconstructing, and utterly destroying the church as deeply and thoroughly as they could. And their reforming predecessors, they knew that one very effective way of eliminating the Catholic Church, at least intellectually, was to suppress and gut the monasteries and to take over and nationalize the universities, which they did with reckless abandon. Then, as the revolutionary era came to an end, you enter into the Napoleonic era, where Napoleon's an interesting character. He wasn't as, by far, he was not as radical as, say, a Robespierre or Danton, especially not like a Marat. He was still a man of the revolution, and yet, as with all revolutions, he wanted to see it consolidated and institutionalized. And he saw, even though he was no friend of the Catholic Church, he saw in the Catholic Church a ready-made ancient institution which had been a force of stability in France and in Europe for many centuries. At the same time, he's also just trampling all over the continent with temerity. I mean, it's just the Napoleon. If you're a war history buff, right, you know exactly what I'm getting at with the Napoleonic Wars. Following him, you have this period of revolutions all throughout Europe. Revolutions of 1948, all of the nationalist revolutions, as well beyond just the military revolutions. You also have scientific revolutions, an industrial revolution, and intellectual and even religious revolutions taking place. The result of this is that by the end of the 19th century, the church's intellectual life, which was already running on fumes after the devastations of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, was effectively abandoned. and the church had the church had honestly entered a period of sort of walled off. I'm going to be careful about how I express this because there's two factions in the church, and I would really recommend, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch. Gosh, I've discussed it several times now. I know I discuss it there's a talk I give on the reforms of Trent, and as well, I think even in the one that I do on the list of prohibited books, I discuss this. But there's obviously that part of the Catholic Church after the Reformation that went out and evangelized the world. Wonderful, amazing, beautiful thing. But there was also this like party, this faction within the church that wanted to sort of wall off and sort of like defend the city against the encroachments of the Reformation, and then especially after the Enlightenment period in the French Revolution, that side really sort of gained a lot of momentum, and you ended up with this like hardcore group of, like, I hate to say conservatives because it's such a loaded term, but churchmen who really just wanted to sort of like hold against the defenses of the modern world. The Catholic Church had at that point all but conceded the intellectual realm to modernity. In fact, modernity itself at this time had been creeping in the nefarious form of the heresy that we today call modernism. And modernism was threatening really to undo, like these conservatives who had this argument that they're just going to wall off against the world. Well, it was kind of, let's just say it wasn't working, right? Modernism had crept in and it was working its way up the intellectual ladder of the church. By the end, you have high ranking prelates within the church who are all but denying the supernatural order of the magisterial church's teachings. Dead in the middle of this, though, even right as the church is losing the papal states to the forces of the secular Italian politics during the unification period, this man of the hour rose up, Pope Leo XIII. And Leo, of course, as you all know, is a very, very bright man with a certain statesmanship quality about him. And he brings to his pontificate, and even in the midst of all this chaos, he has the foresight to see that the church is in dire need of a resuscitation in many, many areas, which is why he was one of the most prolific. He had the most prolific outpouring of papal documents, I believe, out of any pope in history. And one area he passionately wanted to revive was the Catholic intellectual tradition. So upon his election, he immediately sets out to that end. In his beautiful encyclical Aeterni Patris, he lays out this vision, sort of anticipating the entire ressourcement type thing, where he's saying we need to go back. Specifically here, he uses Thomas as a sort of chief illuminary figure to be studied by priests and religious and lay theologians. So now a question at this juncture arises, and I want to draw your attention to it. What was Leo's goal here? Was it to canonize Thomas as the one and only teacher upon which Catholic theology could proceed, or was it something deeper than this? One thing is clear, that Leo and the succeeding popes after him in his wake, who have taken on the clarion call, have certainly placed a preeminence on the study of Thomas, of Thomism within the church, for several reasons, and I want to grant all of this right from the bat. First and foremost is just the clarity of his thought, right? You can find that in many of the encyclicals, and many of the times that we speak about Thomas, we speak about the clarity of his thought. But it's also to the vigor that he applied to subjects. As well, people are Leo and others after him are pointing to the content itself that you find within Thomas's work. So there's it's no doubt that in many ways, for what Leo was looking for at this point in history, Thomas is sort of ready-made to go in the mode that Leo's looking for us to move forward as Catholics. He wants so to be clear, he wants a ready-made response to the problem of modernity, and he saw Thomas as providing this. So that's A, all right. That's point A, and we need, he's saying, look, we need something right now, right here in the 1870s, ready to go, guns loaded, ready to be fired. The result of this is that you get a certain group, primarily among the Dominicans, took this to mean that Thomas was all that was to be recovered, that his content would be what the church would be defining from here on out as dogmatic formulations. To quote, do Catholic theology was to engage in a very narrow reading of Thomas, so that by the early 20th century, there was a flood of manualists sort of vying for primacy, to the point where by 1914, you have the presentation of the 24 Theses of Thomas given as the way in which we were to read Thomas, at least in the seminaries. So it was something of a theological coup being attempted here on the part of some. Now, I'm not going to say this is the across the board, but it is clear that to the papacy itself, for the magisterium, the pressing need was to have men that were trained and ready. So even in that sense, the 24th Thesis was, again, filling a very prescient need. But that need has been weaponized since, to the point that when people discuss something like neo-scholasticism, what they are in fact saying is neo-Thomism, which in turn actually means a very small, strict reading of Thomas himself. Now, I actually make what I think is a pretty strong case in a past video that I did called Franciscan Theology, Its Place in the Church, where I go about defending the plurality of the other orders being studied by Catholics. And I even in that video, I grant kindly, humbly, that Brother Thomas was a masterful thinker, that he's a good son of the church, and that he should even probably be prioritized in today's climate of, diluting or polluting our teachings. The clarity that Thomas brings, I think, probably we should continue to give him a place of priority for the time being and for the foreseeable future. All that said, I do not think that the magisterium itself, and I firmly believe this, has not made Thomas the sole arbitrator of our faith. No saint has that, let alone a very specific 20th century reading of Thomas. The magisterium clearly wants us to take on other very specific thinkers. One of the things that I absolutely agree with the Ressourcement guys about, from the 20th century Ressourcement guys, is their idea that we should be willing to go and re-engage Thomas in ways that Thomas himself was engaging others. I think I elaborate on that in that video about Franciscan theology. I don't want to beat that horse here. It's not necessarily a dead horse, but you just keep beating the same drum over and over again. I will grant that the Ressourcement guys, there's some things I don't necessarily like about what some of them came to the conclusions of, but the overall premise from Ratzinger to von Balthasar to all of these Ressourcement guys was that we need to go back and re-engage some of these people. But that does not just include Thomas to the exclusion of the other minds of the time. It would be a serious error to actually make that mistake. And it's here that I want to turn your attention to the era at hand, the subject of this video. Because if we're going to recover scholasticism writ large, not just Thomas, we need to understand what exactly it is that we are recovering. First thing to point out is what the norm was before the Scholastic, so we can see the transition period. So before this period that we call the Scholastic era, what you had was the era of the patristics, roughly speaking. And this time, the ideal was that a monk would be trained in the Lectio Divina, where the goal was that learning would be for the ends of prayer and contemplation. So a monk would join a monastery. They would be learning to chant. They would be learning to chant the Psalms in Latin. They'd eventually learn to read Latin, possibly, if needs be, learn to write it for the sake of preservation and transmission, principally, but always again with the goal that it lead to prayer and contemplation of God. This era effectively comes to an end around the 11th into the 12th century when we have a few events that begin to take place. First, we see the rise of these cathedral schools, which begin to gain a degree of autonomy and independence. And eventually they would morph into what we would today call a university. Early on here in this, there's a conflict from the old and the new. And I present this in kind of a nutshell form in my live that you can see. I think I called it something to the effect of like the ultimate medieval showdown or something silly like that. But it's really that I go into the conflict between Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard, and sort of I use them as an example of what's taking place right as we're coming out of this patristic era into the university scholastic era, and why it was such a controversial time. So I would recommend go to watch that video. I know I like point you guys. If you guys aren't aware, there's sort of a like method to my madness here. All of these things are kind of like connected and pieced together. I would recommend to go back and watch that video. But really the idea here is that Bernard was a part of the old school way of seeing monastic life as one of prayer and one of preaching primarily. Where Abelard is part of this new process of engaging with learning for the sake of learning, but as I explain in that video, unlike what you maybe have heard people say, that was not really the chief concern of Bernard. It was the actual conclusions that Abelard was coming to that Bernard had a problem with. So go see the live on that. But one of the things that I didn't go into that video is that with Abelard, he's coming onto the scene right as the university is coming into existence. He's trained under a man named Anselm of Leon, not our Dr. Saint Anselm, another important Anselm, not him, but another important Anselm of Leon. And what Abelard does is he goes back to all of the early church fathers that he can get his hands on. And he says, he's looking at them and he says, wait a minute, there's a lot of disagreement here. Like here in the 21st century, you'd probably be like, yeah, duh. But that was kind of like a revelation at this time. He writes this tract called Sic et Non, yes and no, where he goes about demonstrating this and showing the contradictions. This actually leads to a little bit of an identity crisis, kind of one of the major identity crises of the church. It was at this time as well that we get a second identity crisis when Aristotle makes his way back into the Christian West. There's the long story short of that is that there's this series of advances by the Reconquista in Spain where Christians recover some certain areas and they're able to get their hands on some of these texts that the Arabs had, principally here texts of Aristotle on subjects that we hadn't had in the West for a very long time. We did have Aristotle's works on logic, which were used in Western study, at least since the time of Boethius. But his works on nature, on metaphysics, on ethics, we didn't have any of that. So now, not only does it, or not, well, excuse me, not only does it come with his primary works, it also comes with the commentaries from certain very brilliant Muslim thinkers like Avicenna, who, in their interpretation of Aristotle, come up with ideas that were not compatible with the Christian God or with the economy of history as given to us in sacred scripture. So suddenly you have this like twofold front, right? You have Abelard saying that, look, there's all these contradictions and the church fathers, as well as their scriptural contradictions. Then you have Aristotle coming along with a seemingly coherent system of reality that doesn't need sacred scripture for its reference to universals and reality and the cosmos that we in the West had been relying on for some time, right? So something's going to have to give in all of this. And I think that this is where I challenge certain, especially certain like Orthodox thinkers, Eastern Orthodox, who want to attack, or maybe to put it more friendly, to critique the West's undertaking at this pivotal moment. Because the thing is, and I'm actually going to do a talk next week on the defense of St. Augustine against some of the errors of Eastern Orthodox. One of the things you have to consider here is that the East was not facing such a philosophical, metaphysical crisis, as their crisis was actually more existential. They were quickly undergoing a long period of social decay and collapse. First, with the seemingly never-ending battles with the Monophysites that had been raging on for centuries since Chalcedon, followed by the wars against the Persians, culminating in the rise of the Arabs and Islam. So, like, don't give me all that nonsense that y'all were better than us in some way, right? You had your own little disputes that were going on with the Monophysites that you were contending with until you had to give over to things like, battles of life and death. In the West, by the 12th century, we didn't have that stability. The West, Rome collapsed in the 5th century. But by the 12th century, we had built up enough degree of self-sufficiency and stability that we began to engage in the kind of theological disputes, just like y'all used to, except that we were about to embark on it in a different method. And that's where the problem, so to speak, comes in. And that's actually what I want to move to now, is that just how this process plays out. So let's follow the trajectory. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I'm going to see, well, let's actually introduce one important person here again. Moving back a little bit before the time of Abelard that we're speaking about here, to the mid 11th century in Normandy, to the Abbey of Bec, chartered by Saint Herluin, where under his care an intellectual named Saint Lanfranc was trained. And through the reputation of Lanfranc's learning, the Abbey of Bec was placed on the map. Subjects including the curriculum were favorites of Lanfranc were none other than the classic trivium. Lanfranc himself would go on to defend the classic notion of transubstantiation against Berengar of Tours, and he sort of gains this reputation for Bec. And the reason I'm turning to this is twofold. One, I want to situate here at this time, at this place, one of the pivotal shifts from antiquity to the high medieval period, because one of Lanfranc's contemporaries was none other than the great Anselm. Okay, so this lecture is tentatively about reclaiming our scholastic tradition, right? And within this greater structure, there will be some key names that I want to draw upon. Obviously, in the initial call for Catholic intellectuals to rally against modernity, Thomas's name, for all the reasons that I just stated, came to the fore. But other names, in my oh so humble opinion, need to be added to this canon of recovery, especially the names that Holy Mother Church itself has declared doctors as teachers of the sacred, most prominent for fruitful studies. And Anselm is counted very early on among those names. Anselm of Canterbury, declared a doctor of the church in 1720. He was the third among these scholastics to be declared so. He's known as the Doctor Magnificus, that is the magnificent doctor, as well he's known as the Doctor Marianus, the Marian doctor. He is one of three names mentioned in Aeterni Patris, And he's one that is so often overlooked in these conversations. I, for one, love Anselm. He had a great influence and effect on later thinkers, including very much so Bonaventure and Blessed John Duns Scotus. And he really isn't given the credit I think that he deserves. He's one that you students and lovers of theology out there, I think, need to return to as a primary source. Because it's from Anselm that we get, again, in my oh so humble opinion, when it's buttressed by John Duns Scotus later, you get, I think, what is like the great argument for God, what is referred to at a later period as the ontological argument. It's admittedly a much maligned due to it being much misunderstood and misrepresented, but when you actually get at what Anselm himself was getting at, it's quite a lovely little way for the believer to express God as necessity. Is it best for countering an atheist? No, probably not. Actually, not really at all. But the question then becomes, should that be the primary concern of the Catholic theologian? And honestly, I don't think it should be. I don't think countering non-Catholics should be the second, third, or fourth concern of Catholic theologians. We part of reclaiming the scholastic recovery needs to be about having these conversations among ourselves again. Yeah, we can hold up the dialectic and challenge ideas, but we need to have sort of an in-house challenge where it's theologians, Catholic theologians with Catholic theologians. Now, there's a place for answering non-Catholics, but in my opinion, that's best done when Catholics are doing good theology best, not when we're constantly trying to answer every little single objection that comes along, which seems to make up like 90% of what we're doing now. I mean, okay, maybe not 90%, maybe an exaggeration, but it gets in the way of us doing good Catholic theology. But that's kind of a talk for another day. So Anselm, he also paves the way for later developments about the Blessed Virgin Mary's Immaculate Conception. And he gives us some really great insights about the incarnation and about the atonement that surprisingly hadn't been considered much in the patristic era. You will find that in his work, Cura Deus Homo, Why the God-Man. I have some selected works of him on my shelf that I reference. I would love to see him. I'm going to go through some references here at the end, but I would love to see Anselm picked back up and re-engaged. So for now, moving on in the storyline. So we're still left with this problem that Abelard is going to bring up, the yes and no, the contradictions in sacred scripture and in the early church fathers. The first great response to this comes in the form of a compilation. So somewhere in the 11 teens or the 1120s, we get Abelard's Sic et Non, yes and no. In 1150, Peter Lombard, in response, has finished his compilation of scriptural and patristic sources in a work that would have lasting ramifications for all subsequent Western theology that we would know as the Sentences. So the idea here is, look, Abelard's dropped a challenge. He claims the sources are at times incoherent, incompatible, etc., and that only through reason can they be reconciled. And so how are students to take this challenge up? Or are they to challenge it, or they are to shore it up? Is Abelard right? Is it all about reason? So what we need is a compendium of various texts, itemized in a systematic order that goes through all the subjects and cites what all of the early church fathers' sources that we have at hand have to say about specific subjects. About 50 years after after Lombard gives us his sentences, we have the great master at Paris, Alexander of Hales, a Franciscan, who introduces Lombard's sentences as the source book for all studies. It was to become the norm that in order to advance as a master of theology, one would have to write commentaries on Peter Lombard's sentences. In many of the major works that we have from this era, many of the great names that come to us were through the reputation that these men gained from their sentence commentaries, from Thomas to Bonaventure to Scotus and so on. Coming out of this introduction, a process emerges that we will call the dialectic process. You begin with it's actually an invention of this era called the quaestitio. Though it's related to the term that we use today called the question, it's actually a much broader concept. Basically, what it is was that the commentator, the commentator on the sentences would take what they saw as the strongest objection to the position that they were going to take, and that was the quaestio, however you would say that word, the quaestio. Now you would proceed at that point through a series of pro and con arguments. Then you would cite some authority. This is where the scholastics are criticized by later thinkers because they turn to authorities. That's a topic I want to table, though it's a very interesting topic. And it's one of the reasons, it's one of the arguments made today that we shouldn't return to the scholastics because they turn to authority. I'm actually, stay tuned, guys, because I've got a great series that a great thing that I put together for Bonaventure on faith and reason. I think I got it set to air on Thursday. I don't think this is a good argument to be made. We would have to go into epistemology and what it means to be citing authorities. I think there's a lot of assumptions on later thinkers about the fact that they just assume that men like Thomas or Bonaventure or Scotus just like blindly turn to an authority that they appeal to. And then it becomes the logical fallacy, right? An appeal to authority. But there's a lot that they've built up at that point before they start. There's an epistemological foundation that's laid before they appeal to an authority, right? So, anyways, we could table that for now, but that's a good subject to come back to at some point. Then you would reply to the quaestio. Then you would reply to each individual objection. And what this did was allow for a very rigorous form of disputation. And these men loved to dispute, undoubtedly, right? I come along sometimes and I criticize the like debate me bro culture that exists today, but it kind of existed in a little bit more of a nerd way among the scholastics. They love to debate each other. Absolutely. They really had no problem whatsoever disagreeing with each other, which is why it's so anachronistic to try to appeal to Thomas's work as a work that's that's in some way like characteristic of what he's doing. So it wasn't as if Thomas is just like laying down law from on high, right? He was a much more holy and humble man than that. In fact, before he dies, he says explicitly, I hand over my work to the church for correction or reproof, which shows that his intentions were not what certain 20th century theologians claimed that he was doing. Anyways, this form of argument sets the tone, the model for discourse for some time moving forward. After Thomas, and at least after Scotus, most of the traditional schools were doing commentaries themselves on each respective, sort of parceling out what, for example, what Thomas may have meant here or what Scotus may have meant there. But before we get too far ahead here, I want to back up again. All right. I want to give you another important figure in all of this early on, and that's St. Albert, given the sobriquet Magnus, or the Great. Albert is recognized in 1931 as a doctor universalis, the universal doctor. And Albert is a bit of a polymath. He's an interesting guy among all of these. He has his fingers kind of dipped into a multi-form of subjects, from like astronomy to philosophy and biology and music and theology and sociology and law. He's at this pivotal time where, after the initial, I didn't go into this, but there's an initial series of denunciations of Aristotle. Aristotle comes out of Spain into the West. The church kind of is like, back up, guys, here. there's some condemnations of Aristotle. We begin to see a softening of that. It goes from a formal banning of these new works to not exactly a loosening, but the church kind of calls for the best and brightest to work through and extract an extraction of the compatible points of Aristotle, and to eventually and quickly after that, a requirement that one of the things that one needs to as a student to get through as a master of theology was that you would have to work through Aristotle. So it's a quick change. And St. Albert is among those, I mean, it's kind of funny, right? I pick on the trads here a lot, but the trads of the day, the ones that hold Aristotle up as this paragon of natural virtue, would probably have been screaming on YouTube, were it such a thing at the time, that the Vatican accepted paganism if they had the microphone that they had now, and the Vatican turned to after condemning Aristotle to turning and requiring him, right? If they had a microphone at the time, there would have been a lot of denunciations on YouTube by certain people, but I digress. Albert himself he's a part of this initial project. He constructs the curriculum for Aristotle for the Dominicans when Aristotle becomes required to become a master, which, as many of you are well aware, it's through Albert in this curriculum that he produces that we get one of his most famous students, Thomas Aquinas. And his methods was to have a great effect on all future Western scientific inquiry, which in its own right honestly deserves to be recovered, reviewed, and I think at nothing else reappreciated. I don't know a whole lot about St. Albert. I actually, in all of my bookshelves, I don't think I have a single work just by, I might be wrong about that. I don't think I have a single work dedicated just to St. Albert of his, no collected works or anything of his like that. So I don't know enough about it. What I do know, though, is that in terms of content, I think he's quite ahead of his time. In terms of method, in terms of how we do science, I think he absolutely needs to be reviewed and reappreciated, if nothing else. So we've already talked about his most famous of students, right? And the importance of Thomas. So the next figure I want to bring out come out of this age at the exact same time as Thomas, and this is Giovanni de Bagnoregio, also known as Saint Bonaventure, also known as the Seraphic Doctor. Let's see. Now it amazes me, right? It's one of these like amazements of God's providence that God gave us these two men at the exact same time. And then and then he takes them at the exact same time. Both Thomas and Bonaventure were contemporaries. Really does seem that they were friends, that they admired one another. And then both of them die, and I think it's 1278 at the Thomas on his way to the Second Council of Lyon, and Bonaventure while presiding over the council. Just an absolutely amazing thing when you really stop to consider it. These two just, and humbly in my mind, two of the most important people in the Catholic Church that lived and died right here. But anyway, so the Seraphic Doctor. A quick word about the doctors first. The Latin West has recognized four men: St. Augustine, Pope St. Gregory the Great, St. Jerome, and St. Ambrose as what we would call primary doctors or teachers of the faith from very, very early on. Basically, from the time that these men wrote until that point forward, these men were like embraced by the Latin West. It wasn't formally made a thing, though, until Boniface VIII, many, many centuries later, in the 14th century, no, 13th century, late 13th century, Boniface VIII recognized them in a formal way with the title that they're given today, with the prestige backed up by the magisterium, that we get a formal declaration of these men as the four doctors of the Latin Church. It wasn't until several centuries after that we have Pope Pius V in 1558, I think, that he declares Thomas a doctor of the church. As well, Pope Pius V adds the 4 historic Eastern doctors that the West has recognized: St. Athanasius, St. Gregory Nazianzen, St. Basil, and St. John Chrysostom. So at that point, we have 9 doctors of the church formally recognized by the magisterium. Now, Pius's successor, Gregory XIII, it's he who declares a Bonaventure a doctor. So put all of this together in your minds, right? You have in the West 8 doctors recognized from very early on. East and West, 8 doctors, right? Augustine, Gregory, Jerome, Ambrose, Athanasius, Gregory Nazianzen, Basil, Chrysostom. All right, so these guys have been recognized, and they're formally recognized by the church. As well, the church, before they recognize anybody else's doctors, they recognize Thomas. Immediately followed by that, you have the church recognizing Bonaventure. So, outside of these ones that had historically already been sort of recognized as doctors, the 2 men that the church sort of elevates to this status are Thomas and Bonaventure. Now, I grant that the early church fathers, especially those 8, have a sort of place of honorary preeminence. But following that, even in terms of how we could, and probably at times maybe should, be reading the early church fathers, the works of Thomas and Bonaventure, I think, need to be held in a high position. And even for the most adamant of Thomist exclusivists, they really have a hard time denying that following Thomas in pronouncements made from Holy Mother Church, many of the same documents in which Thomas is recognized, there too is the seraphic doctor, St. Bonaventure. And I think if we are going to recover the scholastics, to ignite a true neo-scholastic movement, not just a neo-Thomist movement in the church, I believe it today needs to begin with Bonaventure, in my oh so humble opinion. We've had 100 years plus at this point of molding Thomism in every which way that they could. I think it's time that we give voice to some of the others, and the case I'm making here is that Bonaventure should really, I think, be our man of the hour. And fortunately, right, my little corner of the internet really makes no difference. But fortunately, I have heard and I have seen others say that people with a wider purview of the direction that the church is headed in than I have, and in intellectual circles, anyways, that there is of recent a real increase in the interest in the Franciscan intellectual tradition. It's kind of in the air. And while there's certainly has been, I've seen it, and there will continue to be a kind of a backlash from certain Thomist circles complaining that this is happening, or maybe even I've seen some that seem to be like kind of, I don't want to interpret wrongly, but it seems like at times they're kind of mounting forces against us rather than working with us. But it kind of reminds me, if this is the case, it kind of reminds me of that meme where you got like a circle of people and they're talking to each other, and there's the like one guy that's kind of yapping and they just kind of give him the thumbs up. I think that's kind of what we need to do to these people that are like freaking out that there's other scholastics that are being revived. The church has clearly held up these people, not just Thomas. And I have actually included here, and I would really recommend just to go back and watch the video that I have on the previous Franciscan theology, its place in church history. But just to give you a few documents, let me see here. See if I can do this. So everything's so backwards. I'm just going to hold it up here. One document to read, you can find it online, is Triumphantis Hierusalem. This is a papal bull recognizing Bonaventure as a doctor of the church. Recommend you read that as well. Go back, read Aeterni Patris. We do have Bonaventure recognized by name in Aeterni Patris. Alma Parens. This is kind of a transition period where we go from, okay, we have this initial period of recovery of Thomas, and I explain more in that video kind of what that was and what that looked like. all the way up until this period where I think probably the most important shift from Leo XIII to the modern era is this work, this encyclical from excuse me, Pope St. John Paul II, which I would probably say is a little bit more. It's not more necessarily authoritative than Attorney Patris, but it's certainly an updated view of where we're at today, where Attorney Patris was meeting that need of 1870 of having something ready made. We have here by name, right off the bat. This is true. Let's see. This is true of both the fathers of the church, among whom least St. Gregory of Nazianzus and St. Augustine should be mentioned, as well the medieval doctors with the great triad of St. Anselm, St. Bonaventure, and St. Thomas Aquinas, right? And then he goes on to list some other modern names. But right there, right, with the medieval recoveries, that triad that we're getting from Pope John Paul II there, from Fides et Ratio. Anyways, go back. I go to at length in that video. Let me return here. I'm not saying, and don't get me wrong here, right? Because I am very fair towards Brother Thomas, right? Thomas, I'm not saying at all that St. Thomas Aquinas failed or that we should lay him aside. What I'm saying is that we have a really big tent in the church with some very colossal minds that could help us navigate through and, where necessary, even really, I think, buttress us up and help us defeat some of the forces of modernity. And there's no need for this like turf war to be taking place. With that said, I'm going to bring up probably here, in light of Bonaventure, the name that I think has to be recognized is Blessed John Duns Scotus. While he, for many sundry reasons, has been denied until recent formal recognition of his sanctity, until the 1980s, when Pope John Paul II recognized him as a blessed, elevated him to a blessed. Many in the Franciscan school have viewed Scotus as the most perfect trajectory of where to take the theology when it's done in a Bonaventurian mode. That's not to say that there's a one-to-one comparison between Bonaventure and Scotus. I do think that they have natural divergences, but I am with Father Peter Fellner and others like him who I believe fairly interpret Scotus as the most correct, the saint who kind of puts a fine point on many areas of Bonaventure, from the univocal concept of being to the absolute primacy of Christ to the formal distinction. There's a real continuity within the Franciscan school, and all of this is simply to recognize that there will be no real recovery of Bonaventure that excludes a recovery of Blessed John Duns Scotus. By the time of the French Revolution, the schools of Scotus dominated the European landscape. Now, I do think that, this is my own personal opinion, this might be controversial among some of my Franciscan friends out there. I do think that, given the magisterial turn to Bonaventure, he's owed a place of at least public prominence, maybe even given a place of priority of study for the time until the church has kind of formally recognizes Scotus's place. But within the schools themselves, within the intellectual traditions amongst themselves, I'm perfectly fine and even enthusiastic with the level of significance that Scotus is given, and the recognition recently that he's been given. God willing, the church herself will soon catch up and recognize him as both saint and doctor. But until then, so before I finish up, I want to answer a question I can foresee to all of this from those corners who have seen the need to dismiss the scholastics as dated or even as too fideistic or whatever, right? Who may reject the idea of recovering any of this, including Thomas. Many will point out that secularists or Protestants won't accept these men as authorities. And my response, again, is that who are we going to allow to dictate to us who we can and can't prioritize? I am of the affirmed, I believe the case should be built up about how we appeal to certain people. I'm for that. But I think we should actually be more, if we're having these like deep, like in the mud, constantly having these like epistemological arguments, I feel like I don't want to say we waste time. Actually, I'm going to say we waste time. We waste time a lot when, if we sort of accept that greater minds have worked through some of these things, if you want to work through them yourself, that's fine. If you got the time, more power to you. But I am of the firm conviction that Catholics should never let others outside the magisterium herself dictate who and how we should be engaging amongst ourselves, especially. We need to start having these conversations as Catholics with Catholics, especially within the intellectual tradition. And I don't think there's a greater place that we could turn to than what the scholastics have given us, both in method as well as in content. I don't think we should deny the content of what men like Bonaventure have provided us. Again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be engaging in apologetics or disputes. There's a place for that. We should. But it should make up, I think, a smaller portion of the work that's being done. The bulk of our work should be spent working through the accepted sources, right? If you've already accepted the premise that Holy Mother Church is true and that she is who she says she is, then you've got a pretty firm footing, right? If you want to like back up and you want to have that whole entire like system and that foundation on a like high degree of certainty, again, have at it. But I kind of recommend, for those of you that are working through faith, that the Holy Mother Church is correct. She has given us the names, right? She has elevated certain people to a place of preeminence and has said, these are the men that you want to turn to study. And with that in mind, I would just give you a few recommendations. I know some of you guys like recommendations. I actually planned at some time in the future, I will probably go through and just give like an exhaustive. It'll probably be, we're planning on moving in the summer. And if you guys ever notice, I do have like bookshelves, but I don't put them behind me because I just feel like everybody does that. I'd rather have these two. I'd rather have Mary and Jesus looking over me than a bunch of books. Um, but I will, as we move and I'm unpacking, I'll probably do like a whole like cohesive or comprehensive reading list. But just for what we're talking about today, just some ideas to get you started. One, I do recommend at least, I don't know the best way to recommend this, but I do recommend that you kind of familiarize yourselves with the basic works of Aristotle. Formal training is a very good thing. I'm not saying you need to spend your time reading Aristotle. I don't think it's necessarily the most helpful. Well, let me back up here. The most helpful thing that you can do is spend your time reading scripture. Sacred scripture is without a doubt where the church says that we need to place our primary. But beyond that, if you're going in this direction of you want to understand how to engage the scholastics, you need to have some familiarity with Aristotle. There's great sources online. It's, I would never put down formal education if you can sit at the feet of a master and learn from them. You're going to pay for that, though. If you're disciplined enough to sort of teach yourself, we live in an amazing age and time where you can turn to even like YouTube playlists. I think if you're not familiar, if you really need to go back, you kind of have to familiarize yourself with Plato, then Aristotle, at least just get the basics down. One source that I could recommend if you want to do it for free, the Institute of Catholic Culture offers courses in Philosophy 101 and 102 taught by Professor John Cuddleback. It's pretty good, right? It's an introduction to Plato and Aristotle and Thomas. Beyond Aristotle, though, when it comes to Thomas, I feel like I don't necessarily have like commentaries or other works that I would recommend. Thomas, I think you're best just returning to Thomas himself. I had a good friend of mine who says, look, when it comes to Thomas, just go to Thomas. I his Summa, obviously, I've got that on the shelves. One source I do think is actually pretty good, just in terms of like how to find some things in Thomas. This one is by Monsignor Paul Glenn. It's called A Tour of the Summa. It's literally just he goes through every single question and article and gives a quick summary. And it's very like kind of dry, if you will, but it's helpful in the fact that like if you're trying to get to the conclusions that Thomas is drawing, it's not a bad source. Now, if you're going to start turning to the Franciscan stuff, I'm hesitant to say where to begin here because some of the stuff I have is online. I would say probably begin with the mystical works of St. Bonaventure. Of course, The Journey of the Mind to God is a great one. As well, maybe even before you read that, this is called The Triple Way by Bonaventure. Not as well known a work, but if nothing else, besides the work itself, the introduction here, this translation, I would recommend this translation, by the way, by Father Peter Fellner. For his notes and his introduction alone, probably the like premier Bonaventurian Scotistic scholar in the English language was Father Peter Fellner. And you'll hear me talk about him quite a bit on this channel. And just for his like his introduction alone, which is like massive. It's the work itself is pretty short, but the introduction takes up most of this, as well as his appendix and his notes. Just well worth turning to Bonaventure by way of this work from Fellner. Going through the introduction first, so you can kind of familiarize yourself. I'm going to do what I can on this channel. I can't say that I have the mastery. That very few people would have the mastery nor the sanctity of a man like Fellner. I'm going to do what I can on this channel as I can to sort of introduce certain things. I do have the Bonaventure on Faith and Reason, which will be coming to this channel on Thursday, I believe is what I have it scheduled for. As well, you have the Breviloquium. It's a brief. I don't have a physical copy of it. Brief summary of Bonaventure on his basically it's like encompasses his whole view on theology. Scotus. You got Bonaventure's commentaries on the sentences as well. Very good. His De Scientia Christi on the knowledge of Christ. You have his De Mysteria Trinitate on the mystery of the Trinity, questions on the mystery of the Trinity. All of these are very important works. It's just a matter of getting a good translation. I would really recommend, though, probably beginning with this one, The Triple Way, translated by Fellner, for, if nothing else, for the introduction that he gives. Scotus is, we're kind of early, I think, in the whole process of dealing with Scotus. I mean, when you turn to Scotus himself, you are going to be very challenged. And I almost feel like he's one of the ones where it's probably better to turn to some of the commentaries than it is to turn sometimes to Scotus himself. I say that hesitantly, but let me give you three sources here, absolutely, that I would recommend when it comes to getting introduced to Scotus. First is a primer on the primacy of Christ. Sorry for the gloss and the glare there. Wonderful, wonderful work by Father Maximilian Mary Dean. Wonderful work for an introduction to Scotus on the absolute, the Franciscan thesis on the absolute primacy of Christ. As well, this work, the Mariology of Blessed John Duns Scotus by Father Rossini. Wonderful work on Scotus and an introduction to his thought. As well, I didn't grab it off the shelf, but Dr. Thomas Ward just wrote an introduction to the thought of Scotus that would be perfect for those of you that I think are even just as probably the very first thing to pick up, maybe be that introduction by Thomas Ward, and go buy that book from whatever he recommends you buy it from too as well, so that the money goes to the right place. All right, guys, let's see what we got here. Ave Crux says, don't know if this is live, but when Leo XIII said to recover the scholastic tradition, can you explain at what point they became unpopular, sort of lost? Yeah, so I did go through that, right? We covered with the French Revolution. Really, with the Reformation, there was sort of a turn against it, but the reformers themselves, second, third generation, there was sort of a scholastic embrace. I'm not an expert on what the reformers did, though, but I know that by the time that you get to the Enlightenment, though, that was the kind of point of that, right? With Voltaire and the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment. That's when you really get the actually intentional deconstruction. I mean, even Robespierre himself, one of the things that he did was he wanted to change the Christian calendar, right? So it's a massive undertaking for systematic deconstruction of Christian civilization and life. that was undertaken by the French. Excuse me. Also, that reminds me how I realized that all schism in the church history happened when people refused to obey. Let me try. I've never done this before, just for fun. All right, I can show a quote there, huh? Pope Saint Leo the Ninth, Leo the Tenth. I had never considered that before, right? I did one. I was going to go into Leo the Ninth a little bit, but I didn't for this lecture. Let's see. As I'm learning in my Catholic in Germany says, I'm learning my theology course. We have largely turned away from neo-scholasticism and recovered a kind of Augustinianism grounded in scripture and patristics. Is this accurate? I don't really know what they're teaching in theology classes right now. I will say that neo-scholasticism as a term is a bit of a misnomer because it generally refers to a very specific, it's neo-Thomism, right? It's neo-Thomism of the likes of the 24 Thesis, of like a Garrigou Lagrange, of these, anybody from like, I want to be careful who I say here because I'm not a complete expert in Thomism, but at least from like Lonergan on up through like Maritain, and by the time you really get to Vatican II and the ressourcement guys come into their own, you sort of see that end of that neo-Thomistic phase and a sort of rebellion against it, which kind of led to some of the insanity that we've seen since then. Um, Neo-scholasticism, generally, those people were referring to that very specific reading of Thomas, though. So when they recovered, I feel like this was a huge thing for Ratzinger. Ratzinger wanted to see a recover of Augustinian theology as well as a Bonaventurian theology. That's not necessarily known about Pope Benedict XVI as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the theologian that he was. He cited those as his two main primary people of study. That doesn't surprise me. I've got some thoughts on St. Augustine for you guys next week, but that sounds generally accurate. Though I would again be careful that the neo that my again I don't want to equivocate terms here, but my understanding, if there were a textbook definition of neo-scholasticism as it existed in the 20th century, it was basically that recovery of Thomas to the exclusion, and there was reasons that took place. I go through that in that Franciscan theology because there wasn't a critical edition of Bonaventure, there wasn't a critical edition of Scotus. It took a while to sort of compile these things. I think we're at an interesting time to be alive where all of these things are just happening right now. Let's see. It seems like some of the atheist intellectuals still embody his bitterness and I'm assuming you mean Voltaire, yes, and I would say they've actually recovered it. I would say there's been a neo enlightenment movement within some of this stuff seems to be changing. I have to be careful what I say here because I don't think it's no small feat that Ayaan Hirsi Ali has recently just converted to Christianity. I don't know what version of Christianity she has conformed, and I've seen people giving her a hard time because the little essay that she wrote, she says she's basically, I don't know. I mean, God willing, she's had like an actual interior conversion. The Lord will draw straight with crooked lines, but there's a lot of people giving her flack because she's saying that she's converting to Christianity because she sees Christianity as like the stabilizing force of Western civilization. I've seen Tom Holland making these same conclusions recently where I think he would have counted himself among at least an agnostic, if not the new atheist movement. And he sort of made this like trajectory that, wow, and I don't even think Tom Holland, I don't know if he's converted to Christianity, but he's very much accepted the premise that I think he says we're fish swimming in Christian waters in our Western society, even as it exists today, where the new atheists were sort of a rejection, that you could reject these things but still uphold the foundations upon which it was built, which was built on Christian foundations. It's kind of where Voltaire was getting at. Whereas, say, somebody like Nietzsche, I think, was a much clearer and coherent. I wouldn't even call Nietzsche an atheist. It's just that his view was that he actually saw the ethical foundation that so many of these atheists, including Voltaire, were trying to like press their own ethical system on, was being shored up by a classical Christian ethical system. So yeah, no, they absolutely do. Many of the new intellectuals today follow in that Voltairean line as opposed to, I think, a more coherent Nietzschean line. The analogy that you gave of St. Nicholas getting his robe dirty seems to apply here as well, with the church working with it. Absolutely. I think the church does that all the time. I think the church, I got criticized one time for saying that, we need to be careful how we do these things, because I'm a believer that we need to be engaging. You can go back and watch my talk on, like, say, Catholics engaging Eastern philosophies. I think that we should be engaging, be it Confucianism or even certain Vedantic traditions. At the same time, I don't think it's necessarily something that your average lay Catholic sitting in the pew should be worried about. I think strict, like, catechetical, compendium to the catechism or the Baltimore catechism, we, as St. Paul said, we give children milk, right? Because they're not yet ready for meat. I don't think that's necessarily the kind of thing, like, we shouldn't expect, John and Jane Doe sitting in the pew to be able to work through the problems of Aristotle, or work through the problems of Confucius, or the errors that you may find in Vedantic philosophy, or the truths that you may find. But it's something that we as Catholic intellectuals, I say we loosely, the Catholic intellectuals could be doing amongst themselves. It's a good point. I think this also applies to the balanced debate between evolutionary science and biblical history. The magisterium has never ruled against literal reading, so we shouldn't rule against them. Yeah, absolutely. I've come around to that. I'm a little bit agnostic, if you will, about evolution and the creation debate, but I absolutely don't. People that are young Earth creationists or strict literalists, I don't. You would actually be, I think, a bad Catholic if you were to rule them out, as you're saying here. So, anyways, guys, that's what we got here. Another long one for you all. So, coming up an hour, 15 minutes. I appreciate you all joining in. Again, keep an eye out for I got Bonaventure on Faith and Reason coming up in a few days. So keep an eye out for that one. It's going to be kind of a long one, that one, but I'm going to go through his on the reduction of the arts to theology, and I think you guys will enjoy it. It's thematic, right? We're talking about the scholastics this week. So anyways, God bless you all. Take care.